Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore here in Scottsdale, Arizona. And Barbara is tuning in from home. And we're really delighted to have two Australian authors here with us. Hayley Scrivenor is going to be discussing her brand new book, Dirt Town, if you live in Australia or other parts of the world like the UK. And then it just came out here as Dirt Creek. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit. We still have some autographed UK firsts in stock, although not too many. So I'll go ahead and put links to both of these in the comments field. And Sulari Gentil, our dear friend, and she's almost like staff, really, isn't she, Barbara? She's come in to
And will be actually in October when she
help us.
our 2022 writer in residence.
Yeah. And this is her latest book here, The Woman in the Library. Sorry about the glossy cover. But I will be monitoring the comments and chat fields. So if you have questions for Hayley or Sulari, just go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will bring me back on screen towards the end of the hour. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I am, for reasons unknown to me, suddenly on my phone and not even sure I was able to connect. So if this is a little weird, you can blame my laptop, which apparently decided to do something. Who knows? Anyway, I was so pleased that Sulari did post on Instagram a picture of herself with Hayley's book. And I thought, aha, she's got it. She must have read it. Maybe she will join us to do this conversation, because it's certainly going to be more authentic if we have two Australian authors talking about Australia. So I'm going to sort of move aside here and ask Sulari to take over. But I did want to mention that Hayley has this terrific, well, I don't know if I call it entirely terrific, but anyway, a very long review in the New York Times Book Review, in which Outback Noir is the genre that is mentioned. And I don't know exactly what Outback Noir means, ladies, or if in fact you even think it's a fair label. So why don't you start by discussing that and then carry on however you like. So welcome, Hayley, and thank you, Sulari.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Thank you, Barbara. Okay, Hayley, we've been told that's your first point of order. What on earth is Outback Noir?
Well, it's also sometimes called rural noir, but that's quite difficult to say, you know, particularly if you've had a beverage or two. So I can see the appeal of Outback Noir. And it's interesting, you know, because the part of Australia that I'm writing about is Western New South Wales, which is not what I would actually consider the outback, but I can understand why it sort of falls into that. It's this idea of a physically isolated place that is quite dry, that is where you have farming families and you have small communities, or you have, you know, other proponents of this kind of, you know, Jane Harper is, I think, famously kind of really made that kind of story happening in, for example, a small Australian town. I really feel like her work translated and reached readers all across the world. And so I think, you know, that idea of that interesting and dark and kind of compelling things can happen in the middle of nowhere in Australia is you know, I'm happy to be part of that tradition. But I come at it from quite a different angle in terms of Jane Harper's from Manchester. You know, originally she does live in Australia and has writes beautifully about it. But for me, Dirt Creek, the story of why it's called Dirt Creek is the town in my book is called Durton, Durton. And the kids that live there call it Dirt Town, in that way that children often come up with sort of funny names for various places or teachers or whatever. And so and by that logic, Durton Creek, which is in the town of Durton, becomes Dirt Creek, which is sort of, I enjoy the little bit of irony that, of course, it's quite a dry, hot, it's the tail end of spring when my story takes place. So there's not much river in the creek, and therefore Dirt Creek kind of makes sense. So that's, I think, where the book is kind of situated, in a small country town. And that's very similar to the place where I actually grew up. So okay. I live in a coastal city now. We moved here for me to do high school. But before that, I lived in a small town, very similar in its sort of landscape and layout. I didn't know any girls who went missing, which is at the heart of my story. There's a young girl named Esther Bianchi, doesn't make it home from school. And that's not that never happened to me. I didn't know anyone who that happened to, but I guess that's where I sit in that kind of outback noir tradition, I guess.
So this is your debut novel, and you have just burst onto the international scene. Everyone in Australia is talking about this book, and soon I presume everyone across the world will be talking about this book. How has that been for you to come from, I presume you had a life before writing, or a life before public writing, and then suddenly you're in at the top?
It is interesting in that, I guess, like I said, I know I benefit from writers being kind of in the same space as writers like Jane Harper, or kind of people are often like, oh, you managed to catch this wave of Australian crime. And I, to be completely honest, and I never know if it's, you know, I really should tell people this, but I didn't know I was writing crime, and I didn't necessarily set out to do anything other than see if I could write a book. And the only way I seemed to be able to continue and to sit there was to write about a place I knew well. And of course, as I went along, you become more cognizant, you know, what your story is maybe doing. And I think one of the very first things I knew is that a girl was missing and that she had died. And that's not a spoiler because that's on the first page. But I guess that predicated a bunch of things that were going to happen that I didn't know, and maybe didn't need to know, because I think what I hope this book does is really take these characters in this place quite seriously, and the hope is that it's drawing from a rich well of like detail, and that the characters are believable, and then the plot and the more formal elements of crime, which I have really come to admire, and really and having just recently read your latest book, really enjoy, I guess, the way that crime sets up an expectation that you can play into or against. But in a way, I think that formal element over the top, it pushed me further than I would have gone. And I feel like that sits along with all the other work that I was doing in a way. So I'm really happy to have accidentally written the kind of book that gets sold in that way of like, oh, this is unputdownable, or this is your next crime read. And of course, we all know how generous and wonderful crime readers are. And crime writers are wonderful and generous because we have those kinds of readers that read a lot, I think, you know. So you're never like, oh, I don't want to recommend Sulari's book because then people won't read mine. It's like, no, they're going to read mine and yours. And that's just how crime readers are. So I feel really happy on that level because I always wanted my book to be read, but I certainly would never say that there was like a dot point, like, you know, even to be reviewed in the New York Times, as Barbara was talking about, was never something that I thought it would be a small, strange little book that no one would read, except maybe my mum and my PhD examiners, because of course I started the book as part of a PhD.
Yeah, it's always the small, strange books in my experience that surprise you. So the book has roving on, or several different points of view, so they alternate within the chapter. My favorite was Ronnie's point of view. There's something quite whimsical and almost To Kill a Mockingbird about it, the way she describes Esther. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how you got into the mindset of a 12-year-old girl and made that sound, you know, not just believable, but sort of more than believable? It sounds like the kind of memories you have of being 12.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, because Ronnie is definitely the character closest to me. And Dirt Creek is set in 2001 when Ronnie is 12, and I was 12 in 2001. And so in a way, she was the easiest character to write because I kind of knew the details of her life. You know, and Ronnie, rather like me, is always thinking about where her next snack is going to come from. So she's always, you know, you could tell I was really hungry when I was writing the book because there's always, she's just always sort of aware of what snack she might get access to or what's coming up. And I think though, you know, and she's kind of a bit bossy and she's a bit of a know-it-all. She has her flaws. And one of the fun things about her character is that she thinks she understands perfectly everything that's going on, when of course we as the reader sometimes are able to see a little bit further than she can into kind of the events that are happening around her. But one of her most redeeming qualities, I think, is that she does love her best friend. And Esther, you know, I was aware when we discover Esther's body in the first page that sort of I guess sometimes we encounter a victim and we see them and they set the plot in action, and then that's kind of maybe they don't sit with us for a long time afterwards. We're not thinking about that character as much as we are using them as a way to kind of progress through the plot. But for me, every character in some way is a way to look at Esther. So though we never hear from the missing girl, Ronnie in particular allows us to access the Esther that she knows, you know, this person who she thinks can do pretty much anything. And I think we've all had those kinds of friendships where not only do you love that person and who they are, but you love how they make you feel and what they make possible for you. And I think that's what's so heartbreaking about Ronnie, is that we know Esther is not coming back and Ronnie is just so determined to be the one to bring her home. And so she was a character that I was definitely was one way through the story that felt very important, because it's no one loves Esther as much as she does, although we hear from the missing girl's mother, and that's a different kind of love, I think.
I was struck by the contrast between Esther and her mother. Whereas Esther, the way you wrote her, she just lit up the page. She seemed to be just this source of light and life, and Esther's mother was so controlled. I've forgotten her name, Mrs. Bianchi. Constance, that's right.
Which is a bit of an in-joke with myself, because she sort of changes her mind quite a lot. And poor Constance is kind of living her worst nightmare, really, and everything she thought she could trust and everyone she thought she loved and knew, it's kind of all changing on her. So she's a hard character to sit with through the book, but she's also a place to kind of, I think we've all had that experience of someone we love not being where they're meant to be in space.
Yeah.
You know, like they should be here, or they should have been home, or they should, why aren't they answering their phone? I mean, this book is in 2001, so none of the children characters have phones, because that didn't feel realistic, particularly in the small country town where I grew up. But you know, I think that's what her character, I definitely don't prescribe to the idea that having a child go missing would make you a better person. You know, like Constance is not, she doesn't like rise above her grief, or she isn't made noble by her grief. She's kind of struggling with it and through it. And that just felt like the most honest way to write about that part of it.
There is a lovely honesty about Constance, the way she just almost closes down and pushes the world away. And that really struck me as real when I was reading that, because, you know, I have children. I can imagine that's exactly the way I would react. So that was so beautifully done. And so, you know, it kind of honored her grief in a way by not turning her into a hero because of it. I don't want to do any spoilers, but the other thing I want to talk to you about is this wonderful we chorus that you employ as a technique through the book. Do you want to talk to us a little bit more about where the idea for that came from and who exactly are we?
Yes, so really it was one of the key sort of origins of the book for me. Was I was interested in stories that are narrated collectively. So there aren't that many. We're used to stories that are told either in the third person, you know, she lifted the knife, you know, or first person, I took the knife and I picked it up. But we're not so familiar with characters that speak together. And the way I think about my collective narration is it's kind of like a Greek chorus in a traditional Greek play. So they're real people. They're almost like the children of the town who come on to the stage, is how I imagine it, and say, this is what's going on. Like, these are the details of the place where we live. Here's a bit of an update on kind of what we know or what's going on. And that voice sounds kind of off-putting, or like it could be tricky. But one of the most joyful things is seeing this point of view that I always thought was quite strange really kind of resonate with people, because I think it is a very old mode of storytelling in a way. We're very used to omniscient narrators, and most importantly, the fact that they have access to certain things means they're really implicated in the climax, in terms of, we wouldn't know what happened to Esther if I didn't have this chorus. And so that was the most important thing. They're not there just for they are sometimes like a nice place to have certain details, or the language that I went for, I tried to be, I think, you know, to sit with these ideas of poetry, or of, you know, they're short, sharp sections, so there's less tension on them to progress the plot sometimes. and they're more about how do we feel and how are we responding to this thing that's happened. But the goal also was that they have to be in the story. They're kind of like the head and the tail and the spine. So they begin the book, they end the book, and throughout the book they come in and tell us things that we need to know. And yeah, it's been a real joy seeing this voice that I, it sounds weird when you picture to people like, yeah, they're kids in the town, but also they're kind of omniscient and they can kind of float above and they can see what's going on. But people, I think we do have that ingrained ability to understand narrators when we see them and kind of go, okay, this is a bit strange, but I'm going to go with it. And it's lovely to hear back that people that gave the story something for people.
For me, it resonated very much with, like, I live in a small country town, and there's always this wee chorus in a small country town where people know things and you don't know how they knew or who was there or why they knew that, but it's known.
Yeah.
And it seemed to ring really true to me of how little country towns seem to have this omniscient chorus that is keeping an eye on everybody. So the old adage about, small towns with big secrets. Anyone who's lived in a small town knows that big secrets are really hard to keep in a small town. And part of that is because of this wee chorus that seems to exist among us, where it seems to be a collective knowledge of the town that's buzzing through it.
And I think there's a real power, when people say you are something enough times, when a collective takes up an idea about you or talks about you in a certain way, I think we've all experienced that. It can be really positive and affirming and joyful when you're in it, but it can also be really horrible when you're not in it. And I'm endlessly fascinated by ideas of us and them. And every character in some way is grappling with who other people say that they are and who they know themselves deep down to be. And I think one of the most interesting characters I enjoyed exploring that through was Lewis, the young boy who sees Esther on the day she goes missing, but can't tell the police for his own kind of reasons. And that's where that, having made the town real and helping see how the town would react to what Lewis is hiding, it enacts on the plot, even though they are these moments that seem at first maybe a little disconnected from the plot. It's all hopefully working together to up the tension around the fact that Lewis can't speak and why he won't speak. Without spoilers, I guess, but
no, it's quite hard to discuss a crime book and avoid the spoilers. The other thing I wanted to, before I start hitting you about process and stuff, the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about that's actually in the text of the book is your acknowledgements. They're beautiful.
They're very long. A few people are like, really? Do they need to be that long?
But they're so beautifully written. I was, it's acknowledgements tends to be some of the places where people just skip over. But I actually quite love looking at acknowledgements because you can really see the author there and see who they are. Would you mind if I read the last paragraph of your acknowledgements?
No, not at all. I'm trying to remember what it is.
How beautiful they are. Okay. Thank you, Daniel, for loving me exactly as I am and quietly depositing smoothies on my desk. Your unwavering belief that I will do the things I set out to do has helped me go further past the cliff edge of my own capacity than gravity would seem to allow. I just thought that was the most beautiful line. And I wanted, so this acknowledgements are notoriously and as almost as hard as writing the the synopsis of a book. So can you this, and the first one, if my recollection is correct, is always the toughest because I remember someone once said to me, there is nothing in the world as grateful as a debut author. And that and that follows through with your first acknowledgements. You want to thank the world, which is why they tend to be longer than all your other books. But how did you go about that process? You have this beautiful book. It's been acclaimed and grabbed by publishers, and you have to sit down and think, well, who do I want to memorialize and thank? Was that a struggle for you?
Not at all. As I mentioned in the acknowledgements, and US readers actually get a slightly abridged version of my acknowledgements. So you're reading the Australian version, so they might go, where is that line about like, it's not exactly the same. It's still long, it's still 2 pages in the US, but in the Australian acknowledgements, I write about the fact that I kept a running, and this is going to sound insane, and it felt insane at the time, but I kept, like, when I was really stuck, I would like add a line or 2 to my acknowledgements. I'd be like, oh, that's right, I went to this place and I you know, I was or I talked to this person or whatever. So I kind of kept a running, it helped me to realize, like, at a certain point I had sort of come so far, and even though there was so far to go, it helped me to realize, like, I'd had all this help, you know. And that it was one thing I love about acknowledgements. And as a beginner writer, I remember thinking, oh God, I'm never gonna be connected to other writers in that way, or I'm never gonna be able to have a joke about, like, going away on a writing retreat, because my writing's never going to be good enough to, like, get into a writing retreat. And what I didn't realize, of course, is that you don't become friends with the people in other people's acknowledgements. That's their people. What you have to do is find the people in your life that encourage you to write in whatever way that looks like. And what's glorious is, over time, even seeing people who I'd started out as just pure friends, you know, we would just enjoyed each other's company, and because we both like writing, that's what we talked about. And then they were publishing, and then they become, you know, they become the names in my book that someone goes, oh wow, she knows that person. So it's a really funny thing where, don't think that you need to have written your acknowledgements at the beginning, because of course the process of writing the book, it's amazing how it's almost like the road will rise to meet you, and you will meet the people that you need to excite you and support you. And I'm very lucky, certainly, to have been shortlisted for things and been able to go on retreats, but none of that seemed like it would ever happen at the beginning. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but certainly that feeling of
that's exactly what I was talking about. I was always terrified of leaving people out, because my acknowledgements tended to go on and on and on.
Very good, Sulari. Let me just interject and say you've done a very good job not leaving people out. I wanted to ask that question because you yourself are so generous in your own acknowledgements. I've been encouraging people to read acknowledgements recently.
Look, I quite love acknowledgements, because I think if Hayley's anything like me, you get to the end of the book and it's the last thing you craft for the book. And at the time, you know, for me, acknowledgements, you know, a book is one of those things that's very rarely created in isolation without any help. There's an entire village of people that inputs, and that's, you know, just even getting to the first draft, and then there's another village that takes that draft and turns it into a book. And there's something, you know, your name goes on the front of the book, but there's something incredibly special about that team, and being part of that team that creates the story that goes out into the world. So I quite, you know, enjoy that whole process. But I do remember that the very first time, when you don't know exactly how it works, it being this monumental thing of terror of, you know, what if I leave someone out? They'll hate me forever. And, you know, can I really have 42 pages of acknowledgements? But it's all of that. But it's one of those things that I really would encourage readers to have a look at, particularly if they've loved a book, because they will see what created the author in those acknowledgements as well as the book.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I resisted this idea of making it shorter, and when I really do, I pride myself on listening to a lot of good advice, and I don't think it's necessarily bad advice to be concise or whatever, but I was so it just felt like this is the first book, and it had to capture not only the people that sort of really help make the book the wonderful object that it is, right? So the publishing team or my agent, but really all of those people who believed in me long before that made any sense at all. And one thing anyone who's written a book shares is that kind of absurd notion of like, I'm going to keep trying to do this thing in the face of just, no one's asking for this book. No one needs this book. Like, look at all these books that exist in the world. Like, why would I possibly need to write a book? So when you've been lucky enough to have people in your life that believe in you and support you, or organizations, I used to work for a writers festival. So I'm always
which writers festival?
Wollongong Writers Festival was now sadly defunct after COVID. Like many great kind of events and festivals, we couldn't quite stand up after, just with funding and all of that. It was very difficult. So, but I do think there's a joyousness in, and I'm always endlessly grateful for people like Barbara who make things happen in the real world, because it's all well and good for me to sit here in my room with my imaginary friends, but without people willing to kind of talk about my book, or people willing to, all of the different ways in which we find books. When you follow that line, there's always someone, a person of conviction and enthusiasm who has made that possible. And so that's another reason I think acknowledgements are really important, because otherwise, I'm just insane. I'm just in this room by myself talking to these people I made up, and none of it makes any sense.
And ladies, before you move on to talk about process, I'm living in fear of that because I didn't charge my phone, not knowing that I was going to need to use it. I may just disappear from this entire thing and leave it to Patrick. But I had two things I wanted to just briefly talk about. One of which is, and Sulari has heard me say that there is what I have said for the last couple of years was an Australian crime wave coming. But I thought that the review in the Times made a very good point that the outback and the dryness and all of that makes a really interesting contrast to the coldness of the Scandinavian noir, which we've had forever, and which I think is dying away some because, it's so overpopulated, although there are great books still to come within it. And I think it's that contrast, between climate, geography, mindset and so forth that is intriguing people, because it's different, but it also is an opposition, I think, to the tremendous influence that Scandi crime has had on everybody. So I did agree with the essay there. But the other thing I wanted to mention was that I think the small town thing really functions the same way that an Agatha Christie country house structure functions, in that you have a closed environment, a circle, so to speak, and there's a limited number of people within it. And if you're doing crime fiction, then you've limited your number of suspects and you've made an investigation possible, which is different than a thriller, a thriller. But I think that the small town, whether it's an English country village or an Australian outback town, or, some burg here in Arizona, functions in that manner. It could be a ship, it could be a theater, it could be, Ruth Ware has done that very well in her books. She's picked like a cabin on a ship or a mill in some place or other. But do you both feel, because Sulari, you two have, your library setting for the woman in the library necessarily functions that way also. Do you both think that it's possible to explore character and motivation if you have this limited group rather than a whole universe of people? That's a moronic question, because obviously the answer is yes, but nonetheless.
Well, look, I would say one of the joys of a small town in particular is, and it's a common thing in crime to have almost a current day timeline with a current day crime. And in order to ultimately resolve the current day crime, you have to go into the past and resolve some other crime that's happened in the past, right? That's quite a common structure. And the joy of a small town is everything is kind of happening in the same physical area where people have been for a period of time, that gives rise to things having happened in the past that will be impacting on the present. So, and also this idea of like forgetting or things not being spoken about or being kept secret kind of makes sense in a space where people are trying to rub along together, right? I mean, I think any community has to find a way to kind of integrate negative things that happen. And when you know, when I lived in Sydney, in a big city, I remember meeting my neighbors who I'd lived next to for 3 years on the day they moved out, right? Like we had never had a conversation. And I was really surprised because they played a lot of Justin Bieber, and it was like 3 English guys in their 30s. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. You know, I just had never made that connection, right? Whereas in a small town, you're going to know, oh, that's so-and-so, and that's what they, there's all these stories about what they did or what happened around that. So I think that is why that makes sense. But I also think any place has the potential to be leveraged to enhance character, really. And I think that it's almost like for me, it's following what I'm interested in, and the places that I know well help me more than this idea of like, oh, okay, that's hot right now, or that's a compelling premise, like I'll just start there. But maybe as I write more books, that will change. I'll just be more like, it'll be fun to write a book that happens, I don't know, in a tower or something.
I think I think you're right, Barbara. The small town does sort of theoretically set up a closed set in the same way as the country manor, but to do that, we kind of have to sort of voluntarily ignore the fact that people could be passing in and out of this country town quite easily. So almost the contract with the reader is, we present you with this country town, and between us, we're going to agree that nobody's moving in or out. In order for it to be a closed set, so that we don't have to go to the trouble of causing a flood to isolate the town physically. So it is a little bit of that. There is, I find in crime fiction, a lot of agreements that you have with the reader, unspoken agreements, where we say to them, if you will allow us to pretend that this is the case, we will take you on a ride. But if you aren't willing to step on with that first concept of isolation, or there's no random stranger moving into the set to cause havoc in the middle of it, then we can actually create a mystery for you. So it is interesting. I think it does duplicate the country manor, but there are problems with it logically. And we get away with it because crime readers recognize it as that trope, as the closed set. And they follow the rules of the closed set when they're reading The Small Town.
Well, that's very true. Christie resorted to a blizzard on occasion, I think, to make absolutely sure that, a flood.
Yeah.
I think Bruce Ware had a flood, if I recall, but you're right. I think that's one of the fun things about crime fiction, is that we do have these kind of contracts, where we all agree. We don't need the hero to age in real time, or the heroine. And, you solve that in historical fiction, because in historical fiction, you can start a story the day after the last one ended, because everybody's already aged or dead. So it doesn't really matter, right? But
yeah, exactly. Exactly. There's all these rules, because I think I think it's the same for any novel. If you really put any novel under logical scrutiny, there'd be problems. But what readers want from us is not a piece of reality. They want a plausible story. They want a piece of imagination. So it's a different thing. We're not writing history or some kind of report for a newspaper. We're writing a novel and a story. And so they will tolerate certain stylistic transgressions or stylistic indulgences that we may have to tell the story that we want to, and to have the discussion that we want to. Because, and that's the other thing that I wanted to ask you, Hayley. I keep saying to people that crime fiction is not just about the murder. And in fact, it's very, very rarely much about the murder at all, that crime authors are wanting to have a discussion about something else. Can you talk to us about what you are wanting to talk about in that novel?
Well, I think there was a sense of, I certainly didn't start going, okay, I'm going to kind of talk through these issues. And there were certain things that crept into the book that I did not start out wanting to write about. So I think when I started writing about a small isolated community, domestic violence, became just a thread that ran through the book in ways that I never predicted. But the one thing that I kind of wanted to deal with, and that's how I think about any book that I'm writing. It's almost, I know I'm going to have to spend so much time with it that it helps that I have a question that I genuinely don't have the answer for, that I'm then working through in the book, because that way I get something out of it, even if it's a sort of failed experiment in terms of a story. I think that idea of actually genuinely coming to it with a question. And so for me, I think there was a sense of wanting to think about what makes a family, or how do we define ourselves in relation to other people, and who should we and who do we give power to tell us sort of who we are. And I talked about Lewis, and I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say Lewis was really a character that helped me work through, I guess, as a kid in a small country town, not having the word queer, but knowing there was something that would not be welcome about what I was beginning to think or feel, has been something that I puzzled over, obviously as a child, and then even into sort of later life. It was like I wanted a space to think about what that looks like. And on one hand, you just want to kind of document. I mean, I think Lewis is in a really difficult situation because his father in particular is very aggressive and violent, right? But also just thinking about my own kind of, the way you make your own queer family, or and so one character we haven't talked about yet is Detective Sergeant Sarah Michaels, who is my cop character, who is a cop from Sydney who comes into this small town to kind of figure it out. And I guess for her, there was this sense of, she and Lewis represent two ends of the spectrum. So Lewis is still totally captive to this kind of small town mindset where he doesn't even really have language for what he knows about himself. He's kind of burgeoning queerness. And then there's Sarah, who is openly gay, or as openly gay as it's possible to be as a female cop in 2001. She's certainly out to her immediate offsider, and that's helpful because in the small town it's really him and her. So one of the fun things about the story is that I didn't have to think too much about other how that would work in other environments. I just had a space where Sarah was trusted and respected by her offsider, and so the point of her is she's doing her job. So in a way, she gets it sort of gets to be something that is just part of her character and is not the point of her as a character. That makes sense. So I think I liked that dichotomy, and if I had something that I wanted to do with the book, it was maybe exploring both ends of that spectrum, maybe. But a lot of it, the way I write is so it's so a million monkeys and a million typewriters. I feel like I'm like, oh wow, that's what I've written today. And then you're trying to make those connections, and then it's only later in editing you realize like, oh yes, there is this ongoing question of like, what do we owe each other? Do we owe each other the truth? Like what, how much of ourselves comes from who we are and who we feel ourselves to be, and how much is it defined in relation with other people? So all those ideas are have been in there from the beginning, but it's interesting to see the way some of them diverge and kind of take their own path, I guess. I hope that's your question.
Yeah, no. So talking about your monkeys, let's talk about process. So are you a pantser, or are you a plotter, or where do you
I'm a total pantser. I mean, the real exception to that is that one of the first things I knew after I realized a girl had gone missing was that she was dead and who had killed her. And so that was like a point off in the distance that I knew I had to get to. And I knew who that person's relationship was to Esther. And so it was like, okay, knowing that, I'm not sure even how many people are going to be in this story yet, and various characters came in at various points. But it was this idea of like, at the end, that is going to be, I was always sort of driving towards that point, even if I took lots of detours along the way.
Do you start at the beginning of the book and write towards the end? Or
I'm physically incapable of writing in order, and so I'm working on my next book now, and I use you can use the navigation pane in Word. You make headings, so each scene is a heading, and I'll go from like writing one sentence in the beginning to like right to the end, to the middle, to just scene that must find a home somewhere that is about her first pet or something. And I just unfortunately can't seem to work in any other way than it's more like a web, or it's like a imagine like an archipelago or something. Like there's one firm kind of point that you can see from the land.
Yeah.
And there's these weird little islands, and you're like, how am I going to get from where I'm standing to that end point? And then you make bridges, or you build rafts, or you get soil from somewhere else and you move it, and you try and ultimately get from where you're standing to the end point. But I don't, it's not a linear, I definitely don't start at the beginning and go and right towards the end. And I'm envious of people that work that way. And I was thinking of in The Woman in the Library. Of course, that's what's so great about it, is that you're reading the book as it's being sent to another character, you know, through a series of emails. And so you get this wonderful sense of the book just unfolding. Oh my gosh, I wish, and I imagine you take some liberties with, it wouldn't be interesting to have the book be an actual first draft, right? I hope, anyway. I hope those aren't your first drafts, because if they are, I'll feel very bereft.
Look, they're pretty close to my first drafts.
Wow.
but the way I write has to be in chronological order. I couldn't write the way you write, because I can't see the story ahead. So when I start, I don't even know who did it.
Yeah.
I just and because I can't see the story ahead, I can't actually think out of order. It actually makes it a bit tricky to edit too, because once I've put it on the page, it feels like that's what happened. And it would be very hard for me to structurally edit, because it then becomes like a memory. That's what happened. Yeah. So it's a bit tricky that way, but
I think it's good. Yeah. And it's good for people to hear that we exist on a spectrum, right? And I think so much of the work of being a writer is coming to terms with how you work. And I just unfortunately have to embrace that mine is sort of utter chaos. And the best thing about having your first book come out is always being able to say, no, there is a method to my madness. In a way, you know,
the chaos works.
Yeah, the chaos works for me after a fashion, you know. And I think it's that the joy of figuring out how you work and almost writing your own instruction manual and updating it as you go, you know, is part of the work of being a writer, I think.
Oh, look, I'll be really honest. I was really ashamed of the way I wrote until about
I think we always are. I think we always are. I think that shame is kind of ever present. And it's all right for, like, you know, I could read an account of a writer I admire writing that way, and I go, oh, how lovely that they can hold all that in their head. But it felt shameful for me. It felt like I had a complete inability to focus and to sit. And I still struggle with that every day. But what's good is realizing over time that you know, you can't go around yourself, you can't go under yourself, you have to go through yourself. Like, you are going to write the book. And so you've got to learn to kind of to enjoy who you're working with, if you can, you know, if you can possibly. This
is a very funny discussion for me, because Hayley, I will tell you without naming, that one of the most famous writers in the world writes exactly like you do.
Oh, you'll have to tell me after.
For over 30 years, and it's exactly the same. And yet I have worked with Sulari, and I find that the way Sulari, I mean, I've been her editor for a very long time, makes perfectly good sense for her. And, you know, it's actually, you know, I never thought about this, Sulari, that I never did try to disturb the development of your story. You know, we tried to make it clear, but I don't think I ever said to you, you have to go back and do it this way or cut it out, because, you know, maybe I always sort of recognized that for you, it would have destroyed the memory.
Yeah, well, you always had a lovely way of nudging the threads. Instead of trying to break into them, you just nudge them where they needed to go. And that was, you know, and that's why we've always worked so beautifully together, and how much, and why I love being edited by you. Barbara has this wonderful eye. She'll read your book in 2 hours, which leaves me gobsmacked, because it takes me so long to read anything. And she will go straight to the one point where things aren't working. And when she says it, you know it You don't ever disagree because you know that was a problem, even though you tried to gloss over it or pretend it wasn't an issue. And she will tell you how to fix it in a paragraph. You know, you just need to introduce a conversation here, or you need to slow the timeline here, or whatever, and all of a sudden it'll work. So I mean, it's one of the, I suppose I haven't spoken to you about your relationship with an editor and what it's like to work with an editor for the first time. But for me, I've worked with lots of editors and lots of wonderful editors, but the reason I adore working with Barbara so much and why I trust her so much is because I know that she won't let anything go. Nothing will get past her, but that she will also.
I'm happy to say Sulari has a new manuscript to send me, which I'm really, really looking forward to.
Which is, and I'll tell you honestly, with that new manuscript, Barbara saw it in a very early form and didn't like it, and
at all.
And I went back and started again because if Barbara didn't like it, then there's a problem.
I think there's a real joyous moment of, I was lucky, one of my really early readers is someone who it's that thing of not letting things go, right? And being like, really? No, I don't buy that. But someone who loves what you love about your own writing and can see what you're trying to do and articulate back to you what you've actually done in a way that is helpful. And, you know, and for me, figuring out the problem and articulating the problem, and then I think the writer can go away and fix it. It's lovely when someone goes, oh, actually a conversation would work here, and you go, okay, good. But even just having someone point out the problem is such a gift. And I loved being edited. It was simultaneously the most difficult and the most kind of ecstatic experience of my life. Like there was, because the book had 3 editors, one here in Australia, one in the US, and one in the UK, and they all commented on the book at the same time. In one big, I had like 7,000 comments or something. It was just this huge process, but it was just astounding to have someone pay that level of respect and attention to my book. And I love editors. I think they're magical, and particularly when you find one that can see what you're doing, what you're trying to do, and help you get there. It goes back to what you were saying about, at the end of the day, it's quite surprising when it's just your name on the cover, when you know that there's no way you could have attained that level of clarity of what you were trying to say without other people.
Exactly. And it's
right, but it is not the case that every editor and every author melt. You know, there's a thing, you know, that a voice or a personality, there's a rapport, but it doesn't work universally. So it's always, from my side, it's a huge pleasure when it does work. But you also have to learn as an editor to step away when it's not working, when this is not going to be a book or an author that you're going to be able to help. Why don't we call Patrick up, who's been sitting there patiently, and see if he has questions or comments from the audience, and also that way, if I disappear, at least he'll be with you. This is so unnerving. I hate this. This is the only event I've ever done on my phone.
Yeah, no, you sound great. Look good.
Yeah.
So nice.
Yeah. It looks better than the laptop. Yeah. Let's see. Yes, there is a question here that I was going to ask. Okay, Anne would like to know, Hayley, up here, your book is listed on every buzz list that I see. How has your life changed now that you've become so popular? And let's see. Sorry, it keeps moving on me. And are you going to attend any of the book conventions in North America, such as BoucherCon?
Well, thank you very much. It's always lovely to hear that the book is being seen, and I'm always very quick to point out that that is down to my wonderful publicist and my wonderful kind of publisher more than it has anything to do with me. And it's been very strange having my book come out in another country, because in Australia, I really, you know, I ran a writers' festival. I have friends who are writers. There's this feeling of like, well, people are just saying nice things because, you know, I bought them a drink that time at the pub, or you know, or whatever. I think your brain is very quick to go, okay, I'm just getting that because we're doing an event together or whatever. So seeing
a lot of drinks, Hayley.
Yes, yeah, I'm very, I need to sell another book, quick smart. But having a book, first of all, such an Australian book reach the US is sort of astounding, and I guess doesn't really feel real sometimes, is maybe the honest answer to that question. But you try and enjoy it, and you try and take it for the compliment that it is, in terms of, if something I wrote is standing a good chance of reaching readers because people are sharing it or talking about it, then that is luck as much as anything, in terms of, I'm really proud of the book I wrote. But I think you watch books, that are talked about for whatever reason, or, the idea is interesting for people at that time. And I do think that can be just luck. So I don't look at it as, oh, of course, this book I wrote this was always going to happen. I'm very aware that people are working very hard to share it with people. And my publisher have been, but really believed in the book from day one. And even things like, I didn't have to change anything, basically, which was very surprising to me. I thought I'd have to make a lot of language, little sort of tweaks and things like that. But I really feel like the Flatiron understood the book, and their enthusiasm for the book has been infectious. So it's certainly heartening to hear that people are seeing it. And I would love to come to the States. I've got no plans this year because I'm going to the UK, and I probably only got one international trip in me this year in the new world order of ongoing kind of COVID. But I would love to come to the States at some point. I think it would be, and I have friends in the States who've been sending me photos of my book in the bookstore, and that's still just, it's never going to be not cool, right? It's always going to be really thrilling. Yeah.
Now, has it been translated into other languages?
There are several translations forthcoming. The most intriguing is Lithuanian. So I'm looking forward to that. But there's about 5 or 6 translations in the works, which is really exciting. I really want them to do a French translation because I can read French. I'm not very good at speaking it anymore, but I can read it. So, and because I know my own book so well, I'll be able to really, it'll be good for my French reading, ability, I think.
Yeah, audiobooks are such a huge part of the book industry these days. Have you heard the audio version of yours, and do you like it?
I love the audiobook. She's an Australian actress, Sophie Lochran, I believe is her name. And she did it's such a challenging book. We talked about all the different points of view. So not only is there kind of the collective voice, but there's a young girl, a young boy, a woman in her third, two older women. But she brings something to each character that's not over the top and not ridiculous, but also things like some of the male characters that are very Australian and talk in a very kind of in a certain way. She captures that without ever dipping into caricature, and it's wonderful. But it's also, there are points where I listen to it and I go, oh, maybe I would change that word or that emphasis, and then that way lies madness too. You don't want to sit there and listen to the whole audiobook because it's not for you, it's for readers. And I personally love audiobooks. And I did The Woman in the Library, the first half of it, as an audiobook in my car, and my partner was really sad that I was switching to my paper copy because the story was just so intriguing. They wanted to kind of keep listening. So I think a good audiobook makes all the difference.
Question for Sulari. How, if at all, has your process changed over the years with all the books that you've published?
Not a lot, actually. I've always just sat down and written. I think in the beginning, the luxury of a debut novel or your first novel is there's no other call on your time. So other than, the usual mechanics of life and children and pets and so on, there's nobody calling about events or about synopses or there's interviews, that sort of thing. So your writing time is clear, and it gives you, and it's not so much in terms of hours, it's headspace. All you're thinking about is that novel. The literary part of you is just invested in that novel that you're writing. That doesn't happen a few years down the track when you have a couple of books. And even now with The Woman in the Library, I'm talking about The Woman in the Library, I'm thinking about the new one, and soon I will be editing the new one and still talking about The Woman in the Library. And so your headspace isn't as pure as it is for your first novel, which is a wonderful, wonderful luxury. I always tell aspirant authors that I kind of envy them because they have that ahead of them, that beautiful, glorious first novel where everything is new and exciting and wonderful, and you can just languish in that novel.
But and of course you're too mired in self-doubt at the time to really enjoy it. So
I
it's
know.
the kicker.
That's exactly it. And there's and when you're actually going through your first novel, you're sitting there thinking, will I ever write a second novel? And stressing about that. But there is that wonderful first time that is just so glorious.
And it can only happen once, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think this, your second novel, your third novel, your 15th novel, they all have their own individual beauties, just like your second child and your third child have their own special place in your heart. But there's something about the first that's almost explosive in its joy. So I suppose that has changed a little bit. I think I've matured a little bit as a writer. So I want more in terms of ambition for what I want my books to do. And I still adore writing the Roland Sinclair series, which was my first novels. But with the standalones, I find myself wanting to play with structure and play with the genre and play with the boundaries a bit more than I would ever have conceived early on in my career. I don't know if that's answering the question, but I hope it's roundabout.
Yeah, I mean, do you find that you've had more confidence to kind of expand what you're trying to do over time?
I think, you know what, I wouldn't call it confidence. I think I have, after 10, 12 years of writing, I've come to the realization that at the heart, it's still a story, just a story. We do our best and we put everything into what we do. But in the end, we're writing stories, not operating on people. No one is going to die if we don't quite achieve what we hope. And so I think in a way, it's not so much confidence, but this realization that at the heart of it, what I'm doing is making stuff up and trying to capture that relaxation and that joy and that, that sort of childlike exuberance in that, rather than getting caught up in all that adult, it must be literary. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Do both of you have like just some basic nuts and bolts advice for aspiring writers? Because we usually have some that are watching.
It will sound very, and keeping in mind that we've sort of established that I'm at the very inefficient end of the spectrum in terms of how I write. But one advice I got early on, and it took me a while to do, but when I did, I could feel the improvement in my writing, was handwriting passages of work that spoke to me for whatever reason. And something happens on an almost submuscular level, I think, when you engage with a beautiful sort of sentence or a paragraph or half a paragraph, whatever you can be bothered writing by hand, word choice by word choice by word choice, you revel in language in a way that I think goes to some deeper part of your, like, we think of writing as a very cerebral thing, but for me it's often I think of it as a very embodied process. So if you can get good rhythms in, or you can see how someone is really subverting your expectation of where the sentence is going to go, for example, that's the kind of thing you can do in your own writing, and no one's going to say, oh, you got this from from so and so. But there is a sense of taking in good words and paying attention to good words had a cumulative effect on my own writing, and I wrote sentences I don't think I could have, that were so ingrained and enmeshed in the details of my world. It wasn't that, oh, here's that great sentence that that Sulari Gentil wrote and now I'm writing it too. It's like, no, I feel like it goes in and it's processed and it sits somewhere in the body, and the body remembers when you're trying to then get across something. So I know it sounds a bit like mystical and woo-woo, but I really think it can be good too when you're panicked and you feel like you're never going to finish anything, you're never going to write anything. And I would suggest it as a kind of breathing in activity. So when you breathe, when you have done a big breath out and you've written everything you can for that morning or that hour that you've set aside for writing, then but you've still got time and you want to sit in craft and think about writing, then that can be a really beautiful way to commune with words that isn't as high pressure as like continuing to try and get them down. But it's totally fine if you want to ignore that advice. I mean, the best writing advice is take what serves you and leave everything else.
Yeah. Look, along similar sort of lines, I still read aloud, and particularly where I don't know what to do next, or it isn't unfolding as I'm demanding it should. Sometimes I just go back and read the last page aloud, and with all the oomph that you would do for an 8-year-old child. So you do the voices and the actions and so on, and somehow that just puts you back in the flow, and the chapter falls down. I would also say to aspiring writers, take your work seriously, don't take yourself seriously. In the end, we're making stuff up. That's what we're doing. And if you can actually live in that space of, I'm just creating something. I'm creating something that may have an impact, but doesn't have to. Then I think you kind of relax into that whole storytelling mode. And it's not as pressure filled, and the expectations don't press down on your story and confine it. And that's what you don't want it to do. But otherwise, try and find a way to write that you enjoy, because most of, doing interviews with Barbara is lovely, doing festivals is lovely, there's talking to other writers is lovely, but most of our time we spend alone with the way that we write. And if that is making you miserable, that's a lot of hours to commit to being miserable. So if you can find a way of putting one word after another that brings you joy in itself, then you're ahead of the game.
Excellent advice.
Yeah. I'm going to add that it's important to persevere. Whatever high roads and by roads or gaps or whatever it is occur, if you really want to be published, you have to persevere. And the other thing is, at some point, you have to let it go. You cannot, if you're on an endless search for perfection, you will never be a published writer. You will always be a work in progress. And I think that's a scary thing, is to let it go.
Yeah.
And somebody else read it. That's a really scary thing, but it has to be done. Ladies, thank you very much. This has been a fabulous, I just can't thank you both enough for a wonderful hour. Sulari, as always, you are a brilliant interviewer. So I was really happy to see your Instagram post and realize that I could invite you to do this at the last second without imposing.
I think people need to see my Instagram post. I was posting about the fact that my dog attacked Hayley's book, and now I was going to have to hand that version to her to sign.
Everybody's a critic, right?
I thought for sure that you had posted it because you were reading it, but I guess I didn't go for it. And Sulari did hold up her copy too, so I'll remind you once again that the U.S. edition is called Dirt Creek, and the British edition, and I'm assuming the Australian edition, is called Dirt Town, and I have no idea why there's that difference. I have not asked.
No, we didn't get to that, did we?
Oh, it's okay. It's the same book.
It is the same book.
Yep, people can really get confused and think one is the sequel or something. So I just wanted to point that out. Hayley, it's a great pleasure to meet you, and I do hope we are a town close to Australia once you cross into the U.S. So I'm hoping that you will actually come to see us when you make
I would love to do that. That sounds wonderful. And thank you so much to Sulari. I enjoyed your latest book so much, and I was just really pleased that you wanted to talk to me about Dirt Creek. Really
congratulations.
Lovely.
I'm so happy for you. It is the best way to burst onto the scene.
It really is. I hope you meet up at the Melbourne Writers Festival.
We're doing an event together, actually, talking about friends in our respective work. So this will be a good warm-up conversation for that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Great.
Good night,
Thanks.
everybody. Thanks for
Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.